Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jerry Valesky, Range and Forage Specialist here at the West Central Research and Extension Center. I'm going to switch gears a little bit to more specifically talk a little bit about annual forages, but also towards the end I have some information related to what Charles Wortman was talking about in terms of the cover crops and interseeding or seeding in some of these different potential forages into residue. Let's see. Here we go. Well, when it comes to some of the annual forages that we might seed, I like to break it down by the different time periods or seasons of the year that we would be seeding these. Of course, in the spring, we've got a number of different cool season annuals, mostly the small grains like oats, spring triticale, spring barley. Some of the legumes, such as field peas, fairly popular. Likewise, some annual ryegrasses have some potential. And even this past spring, for example, just because of the short supply of some of these different small grains, people asked about how would seeding winter wheat or winter rye, winter triticale in the spring work. And it can be done, but a problem with using any of those winter annuals and planting them in the spring is that their productivity is just really not that good. They don't have that opportunity to fertilize. Although I did plant some this spring, back in March, and we were cold enough in April that I think they're going to do fairly well. So you never know. So typically with those small grains or any of these other cool season annuals, mid-March to mid-April, kind of the window of seeding there. Looking for at least 43 degrees in terms of the soil temperature. Seeding rate can certainly vary with whichever grain you're working with, or sometimes even variety. So just recommend checking with the seed supplier or whatever you might be dealing with. Now, of all those, oats is probably one of the more common year in, year out. That's been quite productive, and we've had oats here, both irrigated and dry land for forage for a number of years, and this table just summarizes some of those results over all those years. Last year, for example, 2012, yields were down somewhat, but of course I think it basically contributed that to the warm spring we had, and it got warm that it was relatively short compared to what it could have been. This year, I think it's going to probably be the same way, except instead of being too warm, it was too cold, and so our oats and other small grains that we had for forage were relatively small. But now, of course, we see rapidly jump into some of these warmer temperatures. They're going to rapidly progress in their growth phase, but yet remain a little bit shorter. As far as some of the summer annuals or warm seasons, again, we have a whole host of different possibilities here. The millets, both the foxtail, which would be the hay type, and then the pearl millet, the grazing type. Then your forage sorghums and your sorghum by Sudan grass hybrids. Kef is another one that a few people have been trying, a warm season annual grass over the last number of years, and have had some success with it. On these warm season annuals, the planting date, you can have quite a range here, and I'll show you some data related to that. But typically, like those soil temperatures to be at least 60 degrees or so for many of these summer annuals, some even warmer, such as the pearl millet, more towards that 70-degree area. Likewise, with the seeding rates, a lot of variation here, again, especially with some of these varieties of forage sorghums or sorghum Sudan grass hybrids. So really need to check that out to what rate you should be using. This table here just gives a range of some of the different summer annuals, and this would be under irrigated conditions. And you can see here for those sorghum Sudan grass hybrids or the forage sorghums, straight Sudan grass, roughly 4 to 5.5 tons per acre dry matter yield is what we might be expecting. One of the things I mentioned earlier was on those planting dates. Just a picture here showing 3 different summer annuals. On the left being some teff, in the middle a foxtail millet, and on the right a sorghum Sudan grass hybrid, but was planted on late July, July 27th. And the picture there shown is was taken on September 13th, so just after 48 days. And in the red, the lower part of the table, you see the yields about 4 tons for that sorghum Sudan grass. On the top part of the table, there was an earlier planting date of July 11th, and also there again you see fairly good production in terms of dry matter yield, over 4 tons for the sorghum Sudan and close to 2.5 for the millet and the teff. So very important, I think, in terms of looking at just absolute tonnage of something. Certainly those taller growing sorghum Sudan grass or forage sorghums would be your top choice, even at these relatively late planting dates. For late summer and fall, and again, mostly thinking about the fall forage, again, I really like some of those small grain cereals. And here we're talking about planting dates, late July through August. And then, of course, we have the winter grains, which is whether it be the wheat, the winter rye, or the winter triticale. They're looking at August to September planting. I did see some rye and actually winter wheat planted more back in early August last year, and this is under irrigated conditions, and it did do fairly well in terms of producing some fall forage. So if you get it of enough time, it can certainly produce a relatively good amount for you in the fall. Charles mentioned some of the different cover crops, and Forage Cocktail picture here shows a cocktail mix that was seeded into wheat stubble. So this would be after wheat harvest, and we did this seeding here in late July directly into that wheat stubble. One of the things about this, I noticed in the 2 years that I did it, 1 year it was successful in terms of having enough rain. This is dry land, having enough rain after the wheat harvest, first of all, to grow the cover crop. But then we also did look at soil moisture down to 5 feet through the remaining fall and into the next spring. And then in the next spring, dryland corn was planted into this wheat stubble. And 1 year it did work out fairly well. We had enough late summer, fall, and spring moisture that the dryland corn the following year did quite well. It's just as well as our control plot. The second year we did it, drier conditions. These cover crops used moisture, and we just weren't able to get a decent corn crop. So Greg Kruger here at the center, he and Chuck Burr are also continuing or doing some work related to this. And I heard Greg comment the other day too that from a year or two that they've been doing this, that the moisture used by these cover crops, at least here in North Platte or probably as you go west, can certainly hinder or will use soil moisture and hinder the next season's crop. Cover crop mixtures, again, they do oftentimes include a variety of different things, and I've got one example mixed here showing some of the different legumes, which would be the lentils and peel peas, as well as the radishes and turnips. Again, I mentioned some of these small grains. Last year we did do a trial with several different small grains planted in late summer for fall forage, and of course last year with the drought conditions, some fall forage was a big interest to a lot of people. What could they get in there and grow? We had a couple of different oat varieties, spring triticale, a barley, and a hard red spring wheat. But they did quite well in the fall last year, even much better than they did when they were spring planted. But anywhere from a little over 3 to over 4 tons per acre dry matter yield by the end of October. We also did include a couple of annual ryegrasses in there, harvested them a couple of times last fall. Ryegrass is shorter growing, but here in the case of those ryegrasses, they do overwinter, or at least they did very well here in North Platte, and I'm going to be harvesting them here after this presentation this afternoon, and they look really good. We're going to get another nice cutting from them. As a rule of thumb, at least in west central Nebraska, I think if we're talking about fall forage, I like the September 1st date as kind of a deadline, if you will, to get adequate forage produced for later in the fall. Those warm season annuals, I think August 10th is a date. Now, of course, depending on the state you go, or part of the state you're in, those have some flexibility. We could go a little bit later than that if we were in eastern Nebraska, but probably a little bit earlier than that in the far western part of the state. Charles mentioned some of the residue or forage crops seeded into a corn residue. In this case here, it's some turnips, but there's a number of other possibilities. Some people do use the annual ryegrass or the winter rye. Oats, I think, I've seen can work fairly well too. This application here, or this slide here, shows an aerially seeded turnips into some standing corn. And sometimes I think it's quite fickle. Some years it'll work, and some years it won't. And it's just, I don't know whether it's some timing, the amount of shading in there, the other certain conditions. Success can vary, and I can vary. But I think, as Dr. Wortman mentioned, even if it is a moderate success in terms of getting some of these aerially seeded crops in there, they will provide some forage along with corn residue, but also some of the organic matter potential, and then the possibility of enhancing the erosion protection. In silage corn, of course, with that silage corn taken off much earlier, chances of success are much better. And then he did mention the seed corn, or where from the ground broadcasting, in this case turnips, into the seed corn, going down the male rows of that corn that's removed. Just a little bit, or a few things on the grazing of these annual forages. I always like to point out that the grazing is not as efficient as haying in terms of what we have related to trampling losses, and depending on the time of the year, interrupting that plant's growth. We can reduce some of the potential growth compared to haying. Very important to start at the appropriate or stage of height with many of these annuals. And simple rotations, or anything that we can do to enhance our grazing management or make it more effective will certainly benefit us. Having some stocking flexibility or nearby backup pasture, I think, is also very important, because you just never know what is going to happen. Certainly with many of these different annuals, and depending on the conditions that they're growing, nitrates or prussic acid can have some potential problems. Likewise, particularly in the spring of the year or in the fall, if it's irrigated, some of these can be quite lush, and so very, very low dry matter content in some of these lush forages, and so having some dry hay available, or even particularly in the spring, potential for grass tetany is out there. For some of the small grains, if we're dealing with the spring seeded ones, I like to see about 6 to 8 inches out there before we initiate that grazing. I have here on the slide May 15th to 25th, and it was more like the 25th this year, if not a little later, if we're talking, say, the oats. And then if we're using these in the fall, certainly they do emerge very fast if they're planted, say, in mid-August, and in 30 days they can be a foot tall. But I think sometimes the best way to use those is just to really let some of that growth accumulate, and then come in there and graze out that stockpile forage. On those warm season annuals, 15 to 20 inches on the Sudan grass pearl millet, a little taller for the sorghum Sudan grass hybrids is recommended. For some of those warm season annuals, a staggered planting can be used, and a lot of this, or the idea behind this, is to kind of spread out, have several fields, and with those different planting dates, have the growth at different stages, so it all doesn't accumulate and get away from you in such a big hurry. A rule of thumb I like to use when it comes to what kind of carrying capacity can we get from some of these annual forages. There at the bottom of the screen is 1.3 AUMs per ton of potential forage, okay? And that's assuming about a 50% of grazing efficiency, because earlier I was just talking about how sometimes when we are grazing, we've got some trampling that's taking place, interruption of the plant growth, we cannot ever consume 100% of it, particularly also if we're dealing with some of the summer annuals, the taller growing ones that may have larger stalks. It can be very difficult, of course, to get them to consume, you know, a very high percentage of that. In this table here, I've got some warm season annuals, and on the left column, we're talking or dealing with or showing the potential yield per acre. But just focusing on that outlined in the red dashed line there, assuming that 50% grazing efficiency and about 4 to 5 tons per acre, then if we look over on the right, we could have 1 or 2 or 3 months. That would be our planned or potential grazing period. And that references you then to the cow-calf pairs you would be able to stock that at for that 1, 2, or 3 months.
Jerry, how much would you put if you strip grazed it as opposed to?
Question here was how much we might improve that if we were strip grazing it. Yeah, certainly that, if we're going to get that intensive in terms of our grazing, maybe 1 or 2 day application at a time with the strips, we could probably bump that up to from 50 maybe to 70% in terms of the efficiency. This is some spring seeded small grain cereals, this table. And again, just focusing on the lines outlined in red there. And say if it were oats, for example, we probably have about 1.5 months or 6 weeks of realistic grazing time on standing oats. And if it was some good oats, maybe potentially yielding 3.5 tons per acre, we would probably be at about 2 pairs per acre for that 6-week period as far as a planned stocking rate or carrying capacity. Had a number of people this last fall and this spring thinking about different annual combinations in terms of trying to produce some forage. They were really willing to take some ground out of crop production to produce some feed. And this is just an example here of rye and a sorghum grass. Of course, the rye planted the previous fall. Realistically, probably grazing it mid-April through May or mid to late May. And then we would have to have some other pasture available for that month of June. And immediately after that, rye was grazed out. We would have been planting a sorghum Sudan grass and then planning to graze that at least July 1st into September. Here's one even more elaborate scheme we had worked out where initially, let me see if I can get this pointer to show up. Oh, I got to grab it. But up on the upper left here, the first pivot, or the first, yeah, 1/2 of this first pivot, or this pivot is seeded to oats in late March. The other half would be planted to sorghum Sudan grass in late May. But that first half that was seeded to oats would be grazed from mid to late May through July. And then immediately they'd be able to go to that other half of the pivot, which had the sorghum Sudan grass. And then carrying on with the sequence, again, that initial left half of the pivot could be reseeded to something like oats and turnips in late July. And then that would be grazed in October and November. Where the sorghum Sudan grass was, that could be planted to rye in October and grazed the next spring. So that would be my quick overview of that. Do we have time for any questions? Any more questions? All right, thank you. Okay.